On this episode of Narcissist Apocalypse Q&A, we discuss how trauma and abuse contribute to imposter syndrome. Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse Q&A, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and today we are going to be talking about imposter syndrome, trauma, and abuse. But before we get to that, if you want to be a guest on our Survivor Story episodes, please do go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com. Top of the page, there's a button that says guest form. When you click on that button, it takes you to our guest form page. There you can read all of our instructions and either send us an email at narcissistapocalypse@gmail.com or fill out our guest form and press the submit button. And please do send it in the format that we ask for. And today we are going to be talking about imposter syndrome. But before we get to the full-blown imposter syndrome when it relates to abuse and trauma, let's go over imposter syndrome from its original beginnings, and we'll bring in abuse-related things as we go on before we get to the full section related to trauma and abuse. So imposter syndrome, the name was coined by two clinical psychologists named Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes, and they first identified and named this back in 1978. And imposter syndrome is the condition of feeling anxious and not experiencing success internally, despite being high-performing in external objective ways. This condition often results in people feeling like they are a fraud or a phony and that they will be doubting their abilities. And with imposter syndrome, a person doesn't feel confident or competent regardless of what they achieve. They don't experience the joy of success because they're always waiting for their inadequacy to come to light, that they'll be seen as a fraud, that they are a fraud. So you can see right there, if we want to dip our toes into abuse or psychology jargon, this is cognitive dissonance. And you have two mixed messages here. And in abuse, whether a parent or romantic relationship abuser, they try to create these mixed messages. And by doing so, they become this truth teller, and it can become the voice in your head, and thus easier for them to destroy your competency and also create doubt that abuse might be going on at all, or that you were never abused in the first place. And we'll get more into that later. So the typical symptoms of imposter syndrome can vary from person to person, but they include a strong belief that success is impossible to achieve. They are stuck with a feeling of incompetence even after proving one's competency. Fear of failing to meet other people's expectations is one. Belief that one's success in the past was just a mere stroke of luck rather than hard work and competence. And not feeling comfortable with praise or even simple congratulations. Someone who has imposter syndrome might forever be doubtful of one's success. There's constant pressure to always outdo yourself as well. And there also could be a lot of anxiety and depression as a symptom, and that's caused by these feelings of inadequacy. So there are a bunch of different types of imposter syndrome, according to experts, and they can be characterized into some categories and subtypes, and all of these people suffer from the condition of imposter syndrome, and these are the subtypes according to experts. Number one is the perfectionist, and these people are people who are constantly struggling to be their outright best. They regardless of the effects of their struggles on their mental health. The perfectionist typically sets standards for themselves that are most of the time impossible to achieve. And in the abuse world, and we'll get more into this more when discussing perfectionism over the perfectionist, but when in relationship with an abuser, we hear a lot of perfectionists on the show, And with perfectionists, they could stay in a relationship longer because they don't want to fail. Failure is a big thing for them. And after the relationship, it's a very hard thing for them to deal with. And it really goes so against their belief of who they are. And up next, we have the super person. And individuals in this subtype of imposter syndrome usually struggle with work addiction. They often find themselves inadequate when compared to other people. And the super person will always push themselves harder at all times, regardless of the cost of their efforts to their physical and mental health. So with the super person, once again, we've heard this type on our show before, specifically those who pride themselves on bending over backward for people, and that can happen and they can be taken advantage of. And it is your identity if you're this type of super person, if this is your imposter syndrome. And an abuser can really attack this type of identity and use it to their benefit just by saying, you don't do anything for me. And boom, just like that the superhuman kicks in. And from that point on, the abuser really, really has you. And up next, number 3 on this list is the genius. And this is typically a person who not only struggles with perfectionism, but further strives to achieve impossibly high goals on their first attempt. And the genius feels shameful or unworthy if they fail to achieve this lofty goal on their first try. So I thought about this one for a bit and how this could be applied to a survivor of abuse. And when thinking about someone who gets upset after the first failing, after not accomplishing something after the first try, a lot of the times we hear stories on the show, someone who's really in a relationship for the first time. These things are new to them, and failing at something new isn't something that they want to be a part of. They see the relationship as being a one and done. They only want to be married once. Anything beyond that is troublesome to them. They want to have that house with the picket fence, 2.5 kids type of future. They have this idea or belief of that. You only get this one chance at it, which in part is true. And it's this belief that needs to change in the aftermath of things, because it's going to be a very big struggle. But it is also a struggle within the relationship when you have this specific type of imposter syndrome. And it's okay that the relationship isn't going to work out and didn't work out, but this is a really big struggle that goes on within the relationship. The next one on the list is the expert. And an expert is someone who is never satisfied with any of their achievements, despite being very knowledgeable about a topic or a task. And these are the people who are always pressured to match others who may even be less competent than them. So when it comes to abuse with this one, this type of imposter syndrome can really be used in triangulation. Specifically, I think of a parent saying to their very competent child, how could you not be as successful as that other person we know? We both know they are as dumb as a post, but look at their job and look at how much money they've made. So they're doing this, comparison to you as someone who is less than to make you feel less than. And this is where the imposter syndrome here can happen as well. And up next, we have the soloist imposter. And the soloist imposter syndrome type is characterized by feelings of independence and the need to achieve success entirely on their own. This imposter syndrome type affects people who believe they must do everything themselves and that asking for help or support is a sign of weakness. And we can see this keeping someone stuck in an abusive relationship and not asking for help at all and not having the support from other people and thinking they can get out of it by themselves, and they're alone in this situation. They're not talking to someone. And when you're cut off and you're isolated and you might have shame and embarrassment for what is going on, the soloist can really get into trouble this way. If they're already isolated before, this can further isolate them and it can keep them in a relationship much longer. So up next, we have the noticer, and this type can't be proud of the work that they do. They can't be proud of themselves. They're always noticing the things that aren't right. They can see the things that aren't perfect at all. However, when it comes to other people whose work might not be perfect, they extend a grace to them and can be nice to them about the work that they are doing, but they can't do it for themselves. And so this person is a nice person, but just not to themselves, and they will just secretly believe that they will always never measure up, even though that they can see that someone else is on their level. So here is someone that has abilities but has no confidence really and is really hard on themselves. This can easily be exploited in a relationship, especially if you are helping build up your abuser and looking for the best in them. And they can butter you up, showing you that you do have all of these abilities, but once they do that, they can also tear you down. And once they can tear you down, they can just rip you apart. And then the next one on our list is the discounter. And the discounter automatically rationalizes away evidence of their own competence, their achievements, or high regard. People think well of me because they really don't know what they're talking about. This type of imposter doesn't value or trust the network of supporters that is around them. So they really start to doubt the quality sometimes of who they're comparing themselves to. I might have beat someone in a competition, but who was I really facing here? And, sometimes some of their work that they do, they could be ashamed of that work. And they might say something like, anyone could have done what I did here. It's not that, big of a deal. It's not a big accomplishment at all. And this could have been created in childhood abuse, being told these things by abusive parents, and this becoming the voice that is in your head. And this can also happen in relationships too, and that is the discounted. So what are some of the causes of imposter syndrome? And as we mentioned, one of the types was called the perfectionist, but perfectionism is one of the common causes of imposter syndrome. And people who are perfectionists may feel like they are never good enough and that they always have to be perfect. And this can lead to a feeling of self-doubt and insecurity. And if you've listened to our survivor stories before, we have lots of perfectionists on the show. So when you get a perfectionist that's gaslit about their skills, that's a real lethal combination that can lead to imposter syndrome when it comes to trauma and abuse. And something we've already mentioned here, and there's social comparison, social pressures, sense of belonging. So when we compare ourselves to others, we may feel like we are not good enough or that we don't measure up. And an abuser can be very good at triangulation and use comparison to really break you down. So when it comes to abuse and imposter syndrome, the use of triangulation and social comparison can become a really big thing when it comes to imposter syndrome. Social pressures, being part of a social circle or social group where approval or worth seems to be explicitly connected to achievement. That can be a cause of imposter syndrome. And then there's sense of belonging, which is part of imposter syndrome. And it's really the fear of being found out or cast out, that you'll be seen in a way that you think that you're not competent enough to be with these people. You're not good enough to be with these people. And any circumstance, even in the past, that made a person feel different, like language, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, religion, or physical or learning differences can fuel imposter syndrome. And the person can carry that persistent sense of not belonging long after any of this is resolved. An abuser can really take these things when it comes to belonging, acceptance, social pressures, and comparisons, and really wield them against you. I'm the only one that loves you, they might say. No one else likes you. They increase the imposter syndrome and the cognitive dissonance, and they might be cool and you might want to fit in with them and what they are doing, and they could be pressuring you into things. And there's also triangulation with comparisons, and these things exacerbate the issues. And this just creates a bigger imposter syndrome, and you really start to fight against yourself. And then a big one here, in the causes, unrealistic standards and upbringing. So if we have unrealistic standards for ourselves, then it is inevitable that we will feel like we are not good enough. We may feel like we have to be perfect in order to be successful. And this can be a huge thing coming into a relationship with being very hard on yourself, or just from growing up with parents who have these standards, who's kind of putting that on you, and you're not feeling good enough. Imposter syndrome can run rampant, and our parents and family members can play a huge role in how we view ourselves and our abilities. And if we are constantly told that we are not good enough, then there's a good chance we will become insecure and doubt ourselves. And many of you have grown up in a family that highly values success and had parents who might have alternated between, praise and criticism. And then also, you had families with a lot of conflict and there's little support. And those people are prone to also feeling like imposters. So you can identify it as a trauma or even as an abuse. I said dance around it a second ago, but many might not recognize it, or some might be in denial, as it is very hard to face, which could be a part of imposter syndrome as well. Shame, etc., being a response of not wanting it there. There's not being good enough, and failure feelings surrounding these things too. So when it comes to abuse, narcissistic abuse, trauma, and imposter syndrome, relationships as a whole, you might be feeling that you aren't enough and you might not deserve the relationship that you are in. And this feeling can be really, drawn out in a narcissistic relationship. And, anyone who's experienced narcissistic abuse or abuse in general, can end up with, a case of imposter syndrome. And you might have been belittled, invalidated, gaslit, and this could be going on for a very long time. When that's going on, you're going to be feeling that you might be incompetent. And if you experience narcissistic abuse in childhood, these patterns can really affect the sense of self, your identity, your sense of competence. Second guessing and self-doubt might become your go-to. That might be your natural language. And that can go on into adulthood, and that feeling will stay with you. So one big thing I noticed when I've listened to the show, I hear so many people say, it's emotional abuse, it's psychological abuse, they didn't hit me. I also hear a lot that people had it worse. But when it comes to the hit you part, many abusers never hit you. And it's emotional and psychological abuse. And there's a real lack of validation from the outside world when this happens for everybody. So if someone didn't hit you, was it that bad? I hear this on the show just so many times that people would have left sooner if they were physically hit. And it would have been easier to identify the abuse and understand the danger I was in. I hear a lot, if someone was physically abused. So people who are abused, narcissistic abuse, domestic violence, they have their own preconception of what abuse is. And there's this really big lack of validation from the outside world when this happens. You have that belief too in your head, specifically when it comes to physical abuse versus emotional and psychological abuse. And even when I'm on social media, specifically when I'm on TikTok, I get many comments on the more popular videos of just people downplaying the severity of things, saying that that's just a normal thing in relationships. And they're minimizing and gaslighting all over again. And it makes somebody second guess all over again. And, abusers are smart. And a lot of abusers, there's no threats in writing. And, they might punch near your head and, throwing things only close to you. We hear a lot of driving dangerously at high speeds and you're begging them to stop. And, they make you believe that their anger was your fault. And if you were just more agreeable or more available, maybe they wouldn't be so angry all the time. There's a lot of gaslighting going on here too in the emotional abuse and the psychological abuse. So when the abuse is not clear cut, because of society and because of everything that's going on, you're trained by society, by your abuser, that what you are feeling isn't valid and it's not real, and that you just might be an erratic, distraught person, that you're crazy. And as you're slowly convinced that your feelings aren't valid, that your thoughts aren't true, you begin to second guess your intuition. And it can take years to fix this, to get the validation needed by people in the know, people in the support community, in the domestic violence, narcissistic abuse support community, that, what you went through is real. You were abused. You're not an imposter. These things did happen, and, abuse was real. With abuse and imposter syndrome, it's just a chronic self-doubt that is created within an abuse survivor that just starts to override the proof that was always there. And it's just not in the form of a scratch or a scar or a cut or a bruise. It's there, and everyone who's listening today knows that it is there, or I hope that you get there if you have imposter syndrome. And, surrounding yourself with the right people to validate your experience is a huge thing when it comes to imposter syndrome and abuse and trauma. And, when it comes to trauma, how many times have I had conversations with people? They say to me, other people have had it worse than me. And this sentiment is a huge issue. And you might feel that your trauma is less than, and you are minimizing yourself. And that is a form of imposter syndrome. So let's say a trauma happened. You may not see it as one, or you may dance around it. And eventually, with the help of others like this show or support groups or your therapist, you can identify it as a trauma. And you might feel like you're exaggerating it by saying it was, like you're lying because you're comparing and you're minimizing, and you think you're an imposter, and you might feel guilt and shame and all of those feelings. But the truth is that you were abused. There was trauma, and your trauma is just as valid as anyone's trauma. And not dealing with it in that way is a disservice to you, because it needs to be dealt with, and you need to move through it, and you need to work on that trauma and healing that trauma. And by having imposter syndrome and saying that it's not as bad as someone else's trauma or someone else's abuse, you at that point might not even tend to what's going on with you, and you might kind of let it fester, and it might eat you up inside. So, just here to validate with what you're going through, that everything is real. And if you're suffering from imposter syndrome, it's time to maybe take a look at it and start healing the trauma that you've been through. So this next section might be a little bit redundant, but we're going to be incorporated anyway. And it is just, how narcissistic partners or family members can cause imposter syndrome when it comes to abuse. So according to research, narcissistic individuals subject their partners and family members to so many different types of devaluation, envy, and rage. And with romantic relationships, these individuals can belittle your skills, your abilities, your accomplishments as well. They try to control you, isolate you, or police you. and they want you to remain dependent on them. So their validation is the one that you're looking for, that you put all of your validation into their hands. So there are three main ways that the abuser instills a sense of imposter syndrome into you, the victim survivor. And the first one is to minimize or detract from your accomplishments, especially through comparison or by misattributing these accomplishments to good luck or chance. So what they do here is they may compare you to others to deflate your sense of pride in your achievements, or they may claim that you were lucky in accomplishing your goals and attribute it to your appearance or maybe the connections that you have, even though they might be very well aware of how hard you are working, how talented you are. And they also might say that, it was because of them that you achieved so much. And we hear a lot of that on the show. So number 2 on the list is distorting the positive qualities of their partners and loved ones to suggest that they exhibit the opposite trait. And what they do here is they just nitpick, the exact qualities about you that have gotten the most positive feedback from other people. And they do that to, really belittle you so they can control you. If they belittle you enough, you're putting the worth in their hands. And once they have the worth in their hands, they can really control you. They can give you praise, and then they can kind of take it away, and they can undervalue who you are and how hard you've worked and everything that you've accomplished, all of your competency. They can really do a number on you. And we've heard that a lot on the show. And it can really make you view yourself as the opposite of what you truly are. So that brings in this imposter syndrome here, where you have like two conflicting things going on, and you have the competency, which you are, but they've made you believe the opposite of who you are and what you are capable of. And number 3 on the list is the gaslighting of that didn't happen, you are misremembering things, or the minimizations of things, saying that this isn't that bad, or you're overreacting, or there's justifications like, I only did that because you did this first. It's sowing the seeds of doubt within the relationship to what's going on, and will carry on in the aftermath of the relationship as well. It's done so you will question what is or isn't abuse. It's creating doubt and confusion, and it is done through these methods, and it's huge, and it is part of the whole imposter syndrome from the trauma, especially if you are defending yourself or you are reacting to things. Some people call it defensive abuse. People don't like it when it's called reactive abuse, but that's what some people call it. And it is very confusing. And going back to this statement where someone might say it wasn't as bad as someone else's abuse, that's part of the self-gaslighting and minimization. And this type of minimization is done to lessen the pain of what happened to you. If you say it wasn't that bad, it could have been worse, or it could have been worse, it could have been like this other person's trauma, then you might be saying to yourself, that means maybe it really wasn't that bad. And you begin believing it in your hopes to lessen the pain. And it also can take the focus in your minds and put it onto someone else. If we focus on others' pain, it helps you avoid your own pain. And it also can make the person who harmed you, the abuser in this situation, to not look as bad. It's really just this very complicated situation. Someone that you love, that you trust, who has hurt you. When you say these things, sometimes this minimization about your own trauma, your own abuse, it makes it easier just to deny the pain that this person that you love caused, and that you might think to yourself that they aren't that bad. So if this is happening to you, this is very common. You are not alone, and everyone who's out there is giving you a big hug. It's just a very common thing. It's sad that everyone is going through this, but it's something that most survivors do deal with. So that is it for our show today. And I hope that you enjoyed this episode on imposter syndrome and that you learned a little bit from it. I enjoyed creating this episode. And if you want to be a guest on our Survivor Story episodes, please do go to narcissistapocalypse.com. Top of the page, there's a button that says guest form. When you click on that button, it takes you to our guest form page. There you can read all of our instructions and either send us an email at narcissistapocalypse@gmail.com or fill out our guest form and press the submit button. And please do send it in the format that we ask for. Also at our website, we have our very own safe social network, our support group. So if you want to join our support group, go to narcissistapocalypse.com. Top of the page, there's a button that says support group. And when you click on that button, it takes you to our support group page. There you will see that we have meetings every Wednesday night, Thursday afternoons, and Saturday nights. We also have forum boards for you to post on to get the validation that you need from survivors just like you. And it is a wonderful group of people on there, and you can share your experiences and make friends as well. So if you need support, join our support group today. And if you need even more support, please do visit our friends at DomesticShelters.org. At DomesticShelters.org, they have articles and resources to help you make sense of what you are dealing with. They have every phone number and email address and web address for shelters and agencies, no matter how big or small the town you are in. DomesticShelters.org has it there. It is a wonderful free resource and a wonderful organization. So if you need extra support, please do go to DomesticShelters.org. And that is it for today's show. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you have a good night.